Welcome to Complicating the Narrative. I'm your host, Salma Abdallah. This episode is part of our Better Ways of Knowing mini-series, which we're running on this feed throughout the summer. The Better Ways of Knowing project asks how we should produce, evaluate, and act on knowledge if the goal is to improve the health of populations. And in this series, we're sitting down with people who were part of our first convening to hear their reflections on that question. My guest today is Professor Merlin Chowkwanyun. Merlin is a historian of public health at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. They were a discussant in the convening session on knowledge production systems, and they bring a long view of how the field came to favor the methods, questions, and assumptions it now treats as given. In this conversation, we get into what a historian sees about how health knowledge gets made that others tend to miss. What happened when history dropped out of public health research, their work on toxidocs and industry practices, and the tension they sit with between taking community knowledge seriously and defending the expertise they spent years building. We also talk about why they turned their attention to law and what public health stands to lose by not understanding the legal scaffoldings it depends on. Merlin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am actually, first of all, I have to say, I'm excited about all the sessions we're recording with people from the convening. I am excited the most about this one. I'm hoping I'm not overselling it to the audience, but I'm deeply excited about what you have to say. I think it's really interesting. I think it's new and different. And I also think it's a historian perspective is always welcome, at least in the space I occupy. So you are part of the knowledge production system session. At least that's the main session you contributed to in the convening. Right. And part of it was showing how we should think about history as part of the knowledge production system in public health. By your own, I think, confession during the meeting, you said you're like an odd duck as a historian within a school of public health that is full of epidemiologists and statisticians. So what do you think that as a historian, perspective that you provide within a school of public health that is different from what epidemiologists, statisticians provide that is also helpful for knowledge production in public health?
That's a great question. I like the question too, because I've thought about how I would answer it if I wasn't a historian. And I would kind of understand the skepticism of my colleagues, particularly ones that work in on the ground, emergency disaster relief things, whether it's responding to a pandemic or an earthquake or something like that. What does mining the past have to do with some here and now, sort of emergency? So I understand that. But I would say history provides a couple of things. The most top level thing is it offers you a long view, and it lets you sort of situate public health work not just in the here and now, but in a kind of long chronological temporal arc. And it makes you realize that the nature of public health work in any given time period is often the byproduct of things that happened in that specific period. So the methods that are favored and the methods that are less favored, the topics that are deemed worthy of study and ones that aren't prioritized. History kind of gives you this long arc. And if you actually lay out the public health profession, quote unquote, in this long arc, you can sort of see different sorts of priorities that were emphasized at some points but weren't emphasized at other points. And then that leads to the question of, why? So I'll give you one example that I've been thinking about a lot. The field of occupational safety and health, that is worker health, particularly workers who work in dangerous trades, but other kinds of work as well. That was sort of the animating impulse behind American public health in the 1910s to the 1930s. And then it sort of has slowly over time really kind of slipped and been quite marginal. So at my public health school, we actually have nobody who is like a specialist in occupational safety and health. So if you came to my school and you said that, I am very concerned about factory workers who are breathing fumes from a company that is manufacturing polyvinyl chloride, we would not really have people for you. And I think that's nothing a knock against my school. It's just something that has happened in the public health profession. There have been other topics that have been elevated, but others that have decreased. So I think that's one thing that history gets you. It helps you kind of understand that public health is not just this thing that's written in a textbook, and in a timeless way, everything in that textbook has always been the same, whether you've been studying public health in the 1940s or whether you're studying in 2026. I think the other thing that's really important for me is that, and I think about this a lot at a time when public health, I think both in the academic space and in the practitioner space, is facing an existential crisis, just on the money and funding alone. But the one thing that history is really useful for is it really reminds you of something that seems so simple, but a lot of people forget. And it's that nothing is inevitable. So
Hmm.
things that looked like they were almost like inscribed in some kind of natural order, and that there was no way to kind of reverse them or mitigate them. Actually, if you look at the arc of history, you can sort of see that things change actually all the time, sometimes really slowly, but also sometimes really rapidly. And sometimes this is both a negative insight and a positive insight. So,
Hmm.
there are, for example, historical expansions of rights to people, and then very suddenly they get yanked away, in 10 or 15 years, and nobody necessarily anticipates that. But this is also a way to actually read the present optimistically, because even if things seem really doomsday and inevitable and you want to be really fatalistic, generally speaking, things do change. And so I think that's
Hmm.
another thing that's really helpful. And then, just really last and very quickly, we can talk about it a little bit more if we like. But I I've been very interested in what people consider data in our
Hmm.
field, like legitimate data, illegitimate data, or even data that they know about and data that they don't know about. And I actually think history, if more people knew about it, they would really be fascinated with our primary kind of data, which is archives.
Hmm.
Right now in the world, there are millions of boxes of stuff from, prior periods that I think can tell us all sorts of things about how public health works and why some populations are healthy or not, what kind of interventions have or haven't worked. And my general sense is that people in public health don't really know about archives or documents and other kinds of artifacts that are in these archives, but that if they did, they would have all kinds of really creative ideas and methods that they could harness on this material. So one of the things I try to do, even though it's kind of more of a mundane sell for history, is
Hmm.
just say, hey, there's all these cool kinds of data sources out there that I think could really help shed light on some of the questions you're interested in. So I think that's kind of my sell for history.
So okay, so many questions for each one of the three areas, which makes it
Yeah,
very
yeah.
hard because I think we can go in so many directions. Before we get into those, because I am actually really interested in like what are the implications of those three areas that you highlighted, why we should care more about having a history perspective in public health. But before that, if you can just maybe diagnostically, why do you think we stopped having, or maybe we never had, like history doesn't have a more prominent space in schools of public health or in public health thinking? Do you think this is just different from what happened in the past? Uh, if it is or if it's not, why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one where I can only speculate. This is actually something I've actually wanted to do a dive in. And
Hmm.
speaking of archives, I've really actually wanted to go into like
Hmm.
NIH archives and see, why certain kinds of methods were prized more than others. But I think there's a reasonable kind of sketch that you can make. And just one thing before I talk about it. This is one thing that always has really been surprising to me. The editor of the American Journal of Public Health, our
Hmm.
field's flagship journal, in the mid 20th century, was a guy named George Rosen, who was a
Hmm.
historian. And so this is something I think would be rather unthinkable today, right?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
a historian were the editor, it'd be like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so it's like, why, what changed from a period where a historian was an acceptable editor of a flagship journal to now where that I think would be less likely? I think it's a couple things. One is in the 1960s and really the 1970s, you have the rise of a new kind of research that is premised very heavily on huge quantitative data sets, secondary data sets. And some of this occurs within the academy, but also some of it is outside the academy. This is when organizations like Mathematica and Manpower start to rise, policy science as an actual field where you use tons of data to evaluate whether or not a policy is good or bad starts to arise. So I think some of that and the view that that sort of research tends to ask a hypothesis sort of question that's
Yeah.
falsifiable, and your goal is really to find out, okay, did the inventor intervention work or did it not work? Did more people do this or did less people do this? Which is
Yeah.
a perfectly fine mode of research, but I think that mode of research for some reason came to predominate. And I think it's because people thought, quote unquote, it was more scientific, more rigorous, the best way of reflecting reality. And so any sort of work that doesn't necessarily kind of conform to that sort of mode kind of got sidelined. And so I think that's what happened. It's sort of this quest and desire to have public health research resemble, physics as
Yeah.
much as possible.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, I like that research. I'm not
Yeah.
against that research. I just don't think it's the only sort of research and way to frame a question.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because it seems like that's a place we always end up at when we talk about the history of mental health research, where there's a certain time where everyone thought we need to have mental health research to perfectly resemble what we do in other biomedical research, and that just changed the trajectory of the field. It makes me more and more interested in how changing funding structures or standardization then just leads to like a complete shift of paradigm of like what is considered useful science to do, and then like how does that then trickle down until our like current day. And this is something I'm interested in public mental health, so it would be interesting to see if you do that work for public health in general, what would that look like? So that's the first reason. The second one, and that's a new topic that I'm really interested in, is what happens when something just drops out of like as a not an area of interest. And I sometimes, maybe this is too much psychology. I'm increasingly just really interested in writing an article that says we should just talk about cardiovascular diseases, because it seems to me like for some reason it does get less funding, less interest in the media, less discussions about. There are no great movies that show someone who has a stroke and then they became better. There are a lot of really good movies about
Right,
someone who has cancer and then they get
right,
better. Well, this is
right.
like an example of history there. I guess it's like your example was history, but I also sometimes wonder, like when we drop something, asking you to speculate, of course, but is it, do you think, because people just think like all the wins have happened here, all the wins on this topic have happened, and then we need to move on? Like this is, I wonder sometimes this is what happened with occupational health, where people felt like, okay, we got all the rules that are needed out there, and then we're no longer interested in moving it forward. But again, this is, I don't know if this is an area you would like to be speculating on.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Salma. The sociology of science that I really like to read, Joan Fujimura, she called this the bandwagon effect. And that's exactly
Hmm.
what it sounds. I think our field in particular is very, sometimes can fall prey to the bandwagon effect, where you
Yeah.
have the hot issue. And sometimes it's a hot issue that's really important. Like the
Yeah.
opioid epidemic is a hot issue for a reason. But I also think sometimes we tend to get on bandwagons and we forget, mundane, not things in the news, things that are no longer capturing the public imagination, but that are hugely important. And occupational health, and as you say, a cardiovascular disease or risk of it,
Yeah.
are hugely important. I think that's something that we have to think about a little bit more. How do we guard against that while also at the same time acknowledging that, yes, there are reasons why you would want to dunk a lot of money into something at a particular point in time. But, I also think some of that's pretty dangerous too. Like I've been thinking a lot about right now, there's a lot of not just the funding agencies, but foundations who are pouring so much money into AI stuff.
Yeah.
And when they do that, I often think, one, it's sort of vague. It's like the AI is the umbrella. But I've also seen this movie before.
Yeah.
It was called Data Science and Machine Learning
Yeah.
and Big Data.
Yeah.
And, I think it's worth actually taking a pause and thinking about how much, when we do that kind of stuff, how much it actually yielded
Mm.
or didn't yield. And I think there's sometimes a lack of introspection there for sure.
So then going to the third reason why we should think more about history, which is, I think, relevant to a project you're working on that I find fascinating. I spent a few hours going through some of the online resources that you've put up on your website. It's called Toxic Docs, which really is, I think it's an archival data project that focuses on trying to help us understand how some industries provide some information to the public versus not. So can you tell us a bit about that and why taking a history perspective to this type of work would be helpful?
So Toxic Docs, and I'll mention the URL too, because
Mm.
people have said I should do that. Toxic
Yeah.
Docs, docs.org, is a website. You can go to it at any place in the world. It's free. We don't charge for it. People have actually recommended that we charge for it, and we say no. Our kind of guiding principle is that this stuff is free. It's a bunch of documents that came out of the internal archives, I guess, of mostly corporations that produced a lot of products containing toxic substances like asbestos, lead, vinyl chloride, dioxin. You name a toxic substance, we probably have lots of things on it. And these documents came out of a very unique process to the American legal system called discovery. So, Salma, if you were to sue me right now and a judge said the case can go forward, what they would do is say, okay, we are going to begin a discovery process. And what happens is Salma and Merlin have to open up vaults, emails, stuff in cupboards, whatever, and we have to basically like give it to the court so that lawyers can hash it out. And this thing is really great for historians because if like DuPont gets sued and they have to open up all their stuff in discovery, we get to find out how they talk to themselves, privately. You can see this in documents like board minutes and internal memos. A lot of times they commission unpublished scientific studies to see whether their product is dangerous. There are a lot of kind of crisis PR sort
Mm.
of artifacts there. And so this project came out of a desire from me and my late colleague David Rosner, who actually passed away a couple days ago.
Oh, sorry.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and Jerry Markowitz, and they had been involved in legal cases as expert witnesses because they were historians of these kinds of toxic substances, and so they got called into court to be expert witnesses, and over the years they accumulated so much discovery material, but it was just
Mm.
like in their offices. And we one day kind of sat together and said, wouldn't it be great if this stuff wasn't just sitting in your office, but was actually online at a website? And so that's how toxicdocs.org began. And we think it's a useful site for a couple of reasons. One is just to get the stories. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I think the first time I learned this just floored me was
Mm.
that lead was actually considered a substance that, for a certain level, it was okay to have in your body. And so, for decades, Americans and actually people around the world covered their homes in lead paint. They drove cars that were emitting lead. And now the consensus is basically no amount of lead is safe in you,
Interesting.
especially if you're a child. And so the question is, how the heck did that happen? Was it just that, the science got better and then one day they discovered that, oh yeah, we should lower the lead limit to the recommended level or the threshold of lead to basically zero? No, that's not what happened. Basically, there were trade associations and
Yeah.
companies and scientists who were very much paid for and embedded by those companies who were pushing, an increasingly dubious kind of consensus that there was a safe level of lead that could be in your
Hmm.
body. And so this data set lets you sort of see that and see the documents that demonstrate that. And relatedly, I think it's important that it's there because I'm somebody who, as critical as I sometimes am of the public health profession and, the quest for a pure science, I do believe that you have to prove things.
Yeah.
You can't just say them. You can't just say, like, corporations have been undermining the integrity of what we know about safety. You have to prove them, prove
Yeah.
that. And so the documents are there so people can make grounded assertions about things. You don't just rant about what Monsanto did.
Yeah.
You actually have documents that can show it.
And I find it so interesting because like I don't know if you've engaged with some people who work on the commercial determinants of health. I guess this field that is emerging more now, and it's interesting because I thought, oh, this is actually pretty good work that people don't necessarily, I guess that's what you do in history, but not use it just for this is what happened during that time. But there are a lot of parallels right now of like what corporations could be doing from other industries. And it's helpful to see that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've engaged with some of the people who are doing more recent commercial determinants of health work, and if there are any projects that you actually use this work not just to show what happened in the past, but also what can we learn from what's happening right now.
That's something, Sama, that we'd like to do a lot more in the future is actually kind of draw out in a much more
Yeah.
effective way than we have connections to everything like new frameworks, like commercial determinants of health, to even
Yeah.
policy sort of debates. The main federal legislation in the US is something called TSCA,
Mm.
TSCA, Toxic Substances Control Act. And there's a lot of debate about how, in many ways, it's obsolete. It was last updated in about a decade ago, but there are
Mm.
still, a lot of problems with how we test toxic substances in this country, or how we determine that they even need to be tested for risk, etc. And I think this data set as a whole helps you think about, yeah, you have this kind of demonstration of how being lax about it in the past was not so great. So maybe you would want to be stronger about it in the present. And so those are arguments that I've certainly wanted to hone more with people who work more in that space for sure.
And just because you mentioned the law multiple times, and I think you mentioned it also during the convening, it seems like that's a new passion for you, reading just anything that comes out of a court, thinking about how does that shape our reality these days. Can you tell me a bit more about like why are you, and I think that you said that during the convening, maybe in the event after, you're like, oh, I'm more fascinated now with like when a court just releases a decision and how law is shaping what's happening in the US. Do you want to tell us a bit more about why you're increasingly interested in law, especially in the US context?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, this directly comes out of the moment that we're in. Last year, your institution and my institution, and pretty much every kind of public health program that gets some kind of federal government money saw either grants terminated or grants in danger. There's still a lot of mischief going on with the granting agencies over whether or not they're properly dispersing money, whether or not they are ideologically screening grants for certain keywords and so forth. And all of this sent me back, and I love the title of this guy's blog. There's a Cornell constitutional law professor named Michael Dorf, and
Yeah.
he has this blog called Can He Do That? And so basically, it's every time this administration does something that's seemingly unprecedented, or at least recently unprecedented, that just seems outrageous, Michael Dorf scans constitutional law and says, okay, this is what the Constitution theoretically says he can or can't do. And so I read that blog and the blog of other kind of constitutional lawyers, almost every day last
Mm.
year because it was something that I never had to think about. I
Yeah.
even in a conservative administrations, they weren't canceling grants by fiat or saying if your grant smells like it has environmental justice or DEI in it, we're gonna cancel it. That stuff didn't happen. There was. I'm not saying it was perfect under those administrations, but something like this blatant and in your face was very new. And so my question was that same question: can he do that? And I found myself at night, reading obscure little explanations of things like the Administrative Procedure Act and
Yeah.
what does actually this article in the Constitution say, and are there any precedents for that? And it dawned on me that people like me and people in our profession did not take this stuff seriously enough. Everything from the appropriations process to legislation and rules that say actually this is how funding agencies are supposed to work, to the kinds of legal defenses and also legal strategies that people who are trying to do this sort of thing are invoking. And so I think we need to actually, to ensure that this doesn't happen again, take that stuff a lot more seriously because it turns out, the law and the Constitution is like Swiss cheese, and there's all these like giant holes and loopholes and like kind of strategic little tricks that have been exploited and that have made public health, particularly academic public health, which depends so much on federal grants and things like that, very, very tenuous and rocky. So I've really kind of focused a lot of my attention the past year on really understanding this system and this web of, legislation and law that
Yeah.
that governs us. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think one thing it struck me as someone who didn't grow up in the U.S. is that it just turned out a lot of the things in the U.S. that I admire, and I think I admire the U.S. Constitutional system. A lot of it is norms rather than actual law, and then you
Right.
get and then you realize, oh, I thought this is like, oh, can he do this, or can someone do this? Is like, oh, if you don't really care about the norm, you can do whatever you want to do because the law is, as you said, like there's
That's
a
right.
Swiss cheese, you can get through a lot of it, which has been a very interesting. I don't know what is the right approach for this because you don't want law that is so rigid that you can't do anything, but also you don't want to live in a world where everything is just based on norms. So I agree, it's a really good place for us to actually think about in the future. I do have a question for you. I think it's not directly linked to this, but it made me think when you said we are dependent on federal funding, do you think we should also think about whether we should public health or research or the university should be that dependent on federal funding for science? I really don't know the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
think one thing that's quite uncomfortable for people in public health and university life to really acknowledge is how much over time, and I think this is actually related to the question of why, hypothesis-driven quantitative research reigns supreme
Yeah.
with those granting agencies, because I think it occurred around the same time. But this is something I've wanted to look into more. So this is kind of, again, just a speculative sketch. But at some point, I think many universities realized that the purpose of research grants was not only to fund the actual research, but could be used to generate revenue for the university or to shift operational costs from the university itself to the federal government.
Yeah.
And I think that for, many decades, this system seemed to work until it stopped working.
Yeah.
And so I think something about the reliance on federal government, I don't think it's a binary proposition, but I
Yeah.
think people need to be much more aware of some of the dangers of being reliant on federal funding, particularly because the legal edifice is so ambiguous about whether or not, the chief executive or whoever's in Congress can do the things that you're currently doing, or agency heads.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth thinking about that. I think it's worth also reflecting on the structures of the university and overall shifts. I think, this is a very broad sort of statement, but I spend a lot of time in the university thinking not just about like actual research questions, but doing a lot of administration and administrative juggling. And I think that's a historically specific thing too. You talk to researchers in their 60s and 70s, it wasn't like this, and then it became like this. So again, there's something historically specific about this. So I do think, because of what we've seen with the federal government and a particular very ideological federal government sticking its tentacles into what can be studied and grants and things like that, it would be very much worth thinking about. Now, I don't have an answer. The problem, I have some colleagues who say we should stop accepting money from the federal government wholesale. Why did we even put ourselves in this position of dependence in the first place? And I don't agree with that
Yeah.
either, right? This kind of wholesale, I think, kind of glib dismissal. But I do think it's worth thinking about what the funding edifice is and then doing the work of reimagining, what it might be,
Yeah.
for sure.
I think this brings us to this part of the conversation where I also really want to pick your brain, because I think it would be very interesting to hear what you have to say. But a part of it is like the tensions that exist. There's so many tensions in this moment that I just don't know what to make of them. One of them is exactly what you said. I think the structures of the universities have increasingly relied on federal funding, as you said, to fund other things other than research. People can argue about like what is the appropriate level, but for a long time I felt very uncomfortable saying someone like me who does a lot of work with secondary data, who does a lot of quantitative work, who sits in an office, mostly one grant funds most of the computers that we need, should have an indirect of, like in some institutions, of 85%. Like I always just thought that doesn't make sense. I'm not in a wet lab. I don't even know if someone who's working in a wet labs here in the US, is mostly just like you actually have maybe some human or some bio specimens that need a lot of logistical support. But it was always interesting to me that you treat that work with the same overhead costs or indirect costs as my work. And I always thought that NIH should have some um, restructuring or reform around that area. And then something comes in where it throws everything away with a hammer, and it just becomes very hard then to have an
Right.
interpretation of like what could be done. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but I think those are like the next two questions I have are really in that space, where the first one
Hmm.
is we've discussed in our convening, and I think a big part of what RWGF is doing is thinking more about communities, how communities should be leading some of the work, or should be leading the knowledge production that we need. And I think this is a strong sentiment across a broad number of people from the right to the left. Like you'll find like we just should have communities lead the work we're doing. This is what at least what Maha also is suggesting us that we do. But a
Right.
tension that you and I discussed during the event is I understand that. I have specific feelings about community engagement that come from my work in Sudan. But at the same time, like I think expertise matter. We've gone to school for a reason. Like just to say we should just always listen to communities, that is in tension with me thinking I need to go to school to fully understand something, because then I will provide an informed perspective. And I don't know how to rest that tension. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh no, certainly, Salma. And I've been around the block enough times to have experienced something that I've always found a little jarring. So I've gone to a lot of convenings or meetings, conferences, whatever, town halls in academic spaces where 98% of the people in the room have PhDs and very high level or other kinds of high, very advanced degrees, and they all kind of say it's almost like self-flagellation. They all say, the community should be in charge. What do people like us really know?
Yeah.
And it's sort of this kind of spectacle that over time has generated the same kind of ambiguous feelings that I think it's generating in you. It sort of feels at its worst like kind of a cheap populism or a
Yep.
cheap anti-elitism. And so this is how I've kind of thought through it. It's really through specific examples that I think it's so I don't really love formulations like the community should lead, communities know best, or
Mm.
experts should be in the driver's seat because they're experts. I think there's limits to these kinds of generalizations, but I do think examples can kind of help get you to a position that helps then guide you're thinking. So, one is to understand where that sentiment comes from. Like, when you think about experts and their role, particularly with communities that you might call disadvantaged, there's a lot of reasons why those communities might be suspect and might not respect the views of experts. So, in the mid 20th century in the United States, there was this thing called urban renewal, which was basically when the federal government gave lots of money to smash buildings that lots of people actually lived in, and they put up, fancy condos, hospitals, shopping districts, and things like that. And the residue of that is actually still around in a lot of cities, including St. Louis and New York City. And there's kind of a general memory of that. I think most people in New York probably don't know what urban renewal, strictly is, but I think they do have a sense that experts at some point in time got together and made a lot of policy decisions that made their lives worse. So you understand where this sentiment comes from, and I think it's important to do that. But I don't think, the conclusion to draw from that is, experts don't matter
Yeah.
at all. And I think it goes back to our conversation about history. When people point to examples like that, that was, 70 years ago. And I'd like to think that the public health profession, however imperfectly, is a bit more reflexive and introspective than it was back then. So I think that's one way I think about it is, if you're an expert, are you like introspective enough to think about why people would be suspicious of your expertise, and is there a way to conduct yourself so that you acknowledge that, and so that the quote unquote community gets the sense too that you understand why they might be suspicious of you. I think that goes a long way. That's just a
Yeah.
step one, because there's
Yeah.
lots of colleagues I have who are hubristic experts who just kind of come in and do like the one way sort of lecture. And I don't think that generally goes well. But if you open yourself up, to a spirit of cooperation and acknowledgement, I think that can go a long way. I think the second thing I try to say is that actually having the accurate assessment and an assessment that is reached through, quality methods that are sometimes conducted by experts is actually better for the cause of communities. And so I'll give you
Mm.
one example from that. So, in the environmental health space, there is this belief that there are things called chemtrails. So,
Mm.
chemtrails are basically what they think they are it's like residue that is left from airplanes in the sky, and then the chemicals fall on people and people get sick.
Mm.
There's no real evidence, for this, that most jet fuel, does this. But there are so many things in communities that you can prove without having to talk about like chemtrails or other kinds of stuff that, doesn't have a lot of empirical support, that your
Yeah.
cause would actually benefit from having somebody who can help identify pollutants in your area and identify the source of those pollutants and identify the people in particular areas that would have elevated risk as a result of that. And so, one of the things I brought up on the convening is I think the model movement for this in many ways is the environmental justice
Mm.
movement. And there are all kinds of examples of this across the country. But the basic mode is that you have an expert who knows how to do fancy pants spatial epidemiology and
Yeah.
collecting of air samples and soil samples and things like that, but you do it in concert with non-experts, lay people who can say, hey, a lot of people on this block seem to be having asthma. There seems to be tons of traffic at this particular intersection. Is there a way we can actually see whether or not there are actual harms? I think if we can find more examples of that, it's a step. Maybe some would consider it too small a step, but it is a
Mm.
step towards not thinking about lay community versus expert as kind of this tension, unavoidable tension, but a step towards how these entities can work together. Yeah.
Yeah. I just a plug for something I really like reading. It's I think he's at Yale. Someone a book called Why Nothing Works. It's just about urban
Mm,
renewal and actually thinking about the shifts in progressive politics in the U.S. from one person can just top down do everything, we'll fix everything, and then 60s happen, 70s happen, and then we're just like increasing skepticism of power that led to recognizing that we need more grassroots engagement. And because of that, then I think that book at least makes the argument that exactly what you said, like we should find the spaces where we need that type of movement versus sometimes we need the expert input because at least the author makes the argument that increasing just aversion to power ultimately led us where we are today, where like we don't actually use power to advance any good cause because you always just think of it as like, no, we should just always have communities on the ground, and sometimes that leads to just like nothing happening at all because people are just like in disagreement of
yes.
what needs to happen. So
No,
I think yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And maybe it's helpful for us in public health to realize that's not only a question we're struggling with in public health. A lot of people who work in public policy have been thinking about like what is the right ingredient. And I like your two terms, cheap populism, and also just maybe thinking about examples of what needs to be done would be a helpful way.
This reminds me of something that I have, an experience I have every year, because in the
Yeah.
fall I teach this class on health activism. And it's basically a small seminar. And, for 13 weeks, we go over a new case of health activism, HIV, AIDS, environmental justice, disability rights, whatever. And one of the things I found very interesting is that all students who take the class expect that all we're going to be doing is studying grassroots community groups, and particularly very confrontational ones that,
Yeah.
got out the bullhorn and the placard. And we do plenty of that. And I would say actually that's probably the majority of the cases. But we also study things like legislation, and how major bills like the Affordable Care Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act got passed. And so I think it speaks to what you're saying, that yes, there's all these things that many of these grassroots formations bring to the table, but it's also very important to recognize that the levers of power are also hugely important too, and they're not always located on the street
Yeah.
alone, at least.
At least,
Yeah.
yeah, alone. I like that. So I think the last one, like the last tension I'm struggling with and thinking about more recently is something that you mentioned earlier about why we should have history in schools of public health. I am on the camp, maybe because again I grew up in Sudan and on the camp of, as human beings, if we just look at the data over the past 200 years, we've made tremendous progress. Public health has had a lot of achievements. It is
Hmm.
extremely hard to make, I think, at least for me, to make that argument now, because also we have a lot of challenges. And of course, that progress hasn't been equal, and there's a lot that
Mm,
needs to be done. But I increasingly struggle because I go to places and I work on the social determinants of health and structural issues. So I always show, especially I'm interested in income inequality and wealth inequality and what that means for health outcomes. So I present a lot of
right.
that data, but then I also at the same time show like just globally how much we've done for life expectancy, for reducing maternal and child mortality. And I'm fascinated that I just get emails from students who say, "Oh, thank you so much for showing me this. I've just felt like we can never do anything. The world just feels really bad right now, and just seeing this makes
Mm.
me think, okay." And I don't know how do we like, maybe I'm putting too much of a generalization on public health. It's like we focus a lot on the challenges, and I'm trying to infuse more of it is also helpful to think about the things that we've done that were useful. Because like we don't want to be nihilists, but I don't know what is the
Right.
right mix there, I guess, or right balance of how do you discuss progress while also acknowledging that the world just feels like it's on fire for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, Selma, and I've actually been thinking about this just more generally and also specifically with in relation to public health.
Yeah.
There's an essay that the late social critic Michael Katz wrote about
Hmm.
this, and he called this the problem of pessimism,
Hmm.
and how pessimism could sometimes get you, stuck in a dead end where, you see no way out, and I don't love that, and I think it's even more dispiriting for younger people and students. I've also thought about the problem of pessimism in relation to public health, because there's a cliche about public health that I actually think is very wrong. And
Hmm.
so this is the cliche, and I believed this cliche for a long time, and it's this. It's like medicine has much more social esteem and allure because people can see you break your arm, you put it in the cast, and then 6 weeks later you're fine. They can see the improvement much more readily than public health. And the particular cliche for public health was, when public health works right, nobody sees it, but when it works wrong, everybody sees it and then blames public health. I've
Yeah.
actually come to think this is not correct. I
Yeah.
actually think when public health works, we do see it. And
No.
it is in the form of things like greater life expectancy, or, even if you want to get dollars and cents about it, dollars saved from averting certain morbidities or kind of expensive chronic health conditions. One of the things I do is I study the history of air pollution.
Mm.
Air pollution control in just the past like 70 years has probably staved off so many instances of asthma and lung cancer and other kinds of conditions that are caused by breathing in particulate matter and all kinds of other compounds. And so I think one thing to reframe it is actually to do exactly as you say. These mundane public health things that are so mundane you don't even think about them, and you have no idea what it was like 100 years ago when they didn't exist. Water filtration, air pollution control, basic sanitation has actually saved this many lives, and if you
Yeah.
want to again be economist about it, this many dollars. So that's one way I've actually tried to reframe it. And then a more political way of reframing it is to just talk about, again, this goes to our conversation about fatalism, pessimism, and grassroots groups. There are a lot of things that are very taken for granted by young people today. I sometimes show them ways, mostly male doctors in the OB-GYN profession talked about women as recently as the 1950s, and it's appalling to them. And then I say, the reason this changed was because activists kind of got together, they formed collectives like the Our Bodies Ourselves collective in Boston. They learned some of this material themselves, and they actually pushed that field to be a lot less misogynistic and a lot more open than it was. And so I think, the more examples like that we can plug out for students, the better.
So then, one last question here is: this convening is funded by RWJF. We were very grateful that you were part of it. It's going to run for about 2.5 years. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
have convenings, discussions. We're hoping to have products to start a conversation. We have global learnings from different countries. But if you are advising us, as we think about the world we're in right now, what would we do in the next 2 or 3 years that would be helpful? Of course, we can't change the world, but like moving the conversation forward on a few topics that you think are important for public health. What should we do?
I mean, so much of public health, even with some of the positive court decisions that have come out that have at least curbed some of this administration's worst tendencies, public health is very ailing right now. And the one good thing, and maybe the only silver lining of something like that, is it does offer an opportunity to reimagine things. And I kind of liked how you guys started the convening. I think it was something like if you had like a whiteboard and you could kind of reimagine the whole field from zero, what would it be? One of the things I liked, and I've always liked about RWJ, not just with this project, but in general, is it's a Catholic operation in terms of like inviting a lot of people with different tendencies in and out of universities, different methods, different disciplines. So I would accentuate that even more. We don't
Mm.
need the kind of same old people who use the same one or two methods that dominate, the world of NIH. So I
Yeah.
think increasing the mix in all senses of the word mix is something that a general ethos that I would like to see, not just for this project, but in the public health profession more generally. And then the second one is an institutional one. I think
Mm,
rethinking fundamentally the way public health, particularly academic public health, is funded, the way it forecloses certain
mhm,
ways of thinking and certain kinds of people from
mm,
coming to the table is another thing. And then related to that, and the last one, I do think we have to take very seriously the legal and legislative system. We are
yeah,
in this mess partially because people, say what you want about Project 2025.
yeah,
If you read that, one of the things that becomes really clear very early on is these people, whatever you think about them, they understand how bureaucracy and the law and these institutions work. They did their homework and we didn't. And so
yeah.
I think we gotta put as many resources into understanding, how the law and legislation and the institutions that let us do our work in the first place, both practitioners and researchers, how do they work so that something like this doesn't happen again?
Merlin, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
This episode was edited by Catalina Melendez Contreras with marketing by Kinkini Bahadre. Complicating the Narrative is supported by the WashU Pursky School of Public Health, and this miniseries is part of the Building Better Ways of Knowing project, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. If this conversation was useful to you, please pass it along to a colleague who cares about the future of public health. Thank you for listening.